Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. We're excited to kick off Season 5 on our channel with some videos about the different people groups of the Bible. We're looking forward to bringing you lots of great videos this season. Now, one thing we want to let you know about before we get started is how you can support our work here at Beneath the Bible. Some of you have kindly asked about making donations to support us, and now we have a way to do that through Ko-Fi. You can go to ko-fi.com/beneaththebible and make a one-time or monthly donation of any amount. We're working on some cool bonus content for our supporters, including discussion guides and extra resources for our videos, and we'll let you know when those are available. Your support will help us develop those resources, grow our team, buy some new equipment, and cover ongoing expenses like our website, which we're building out now. Now, with all that said, we are glad we've been able to bring you our work so far for free here on YouTube, and our weekly videos will continue to be available here. If you want to support what we're doing so that we can keep doing it, we appreciate it, but don't feel any obligation. Now, let's jump into today's topic, the Philistines. Now, who doesn't love a good villain? Every great hero needs a great foe or some villainous force working against them. Luke Skywalker had Darth Vader. The Fellowship of the Ring was united against Sauron. There's Professor Moriarty, Hannibal Lecter, Norman Bates, the Wicked Witch of the West, Captain Ahab, lots more. Great antagonists make great stories. But in the story of ancient Israel, one of the greatest villains, perhaps rivaled only by the Israelites themselves, is the Philistines. The Philistines appear in the Bible as an existential threat to the people of Israel after they settle in the Promised Land. They're a constant threat during the period of the Judges and in the early days of the monarchy. They're the bad guys in the story of Samson. Goliath is a Philistine warrior who insults the God of Israel. The Philistines even kill King Saul. And because of this, nowadays the Philistines have a bad rap. To call someone a Philistine means you think they're uncultured or uncouth. But how uncultured were the Philistines, really? What do we know about these people from both the Bible and from archaeology? We actually know a lot about the Philistines. Between archaeology and textual sources, the Philistines are one of the neighbors of ancient Israel that we know the most about. Now, because the Philistines are such an iconic antagonist for ancient Israel in the Bible, they've been the focus of scholarly study for a long time. There are entire books just on Philistine pottery, on Philistine iconography, on how the Philistines settled in the Levant, and a lot more. There's a ton of really good information on the Philistines written by some great scholars, and it's way too much for us to cover in just one video. And we plan to do more videos about various aspects of Philistine life in the future, but today we're just doing a basic introduction. We'll start by looking at our sources for studying the Philistines, then look at some aspects of the Philistine phenomenon, and finally pull it all together into a brief history of the Philistine people. If you want to learn more about the Philistines after this, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our future videos when they come out. Now, one of the main sources for information about the Philistines is the Bible itself. The Philistines are mentioned over 200 times in the Bible, and we're going to go over them all. Just kidding. The Philistines appear briefly in the stories of the patriarchs, but as we'll see, this is definitely an anachronistic reference to the Philistines, since they didn't occupy the Levant until much later. We'll cover why the Philistines appear there out of place in a future video, but not today. The first real appearance of a group we recognize as the Philistines is in the book of Judges, where they are the primary antagonists in the Samson narrative. That story indicates that the Philistines were centered in urban polities on the Levantine coast in an area we now call the Pentapolis, which means 5 cities. Those cities are Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath. These cities were each ruled by a lord, which seems to be the title that the Philistines used for their rulers. More on that in just a minute. The Philistines continue to be Israel's primary enemies as we shift from Judges to the book of Samuel. They capture the Ark of the Covenant and store it in their own temples, with disastrous consequences, before eventually returning it. Increased Philistine aggression seems to be the driving force behind the Israelites' desire for a king. Saul primarily fights the Philistines as the first king of Israel. David likewise fights against the Philistines, starting with the famous story of David slaying the Philistine warrior Goliath. We see an interesting wrinkle in this relationship between the Israelites and the Philistines as David spends some time with the Philistines as a mercenary warrior. David also seems to have Philistines as his paid bodyguard force. Now, despite being mortal enemies, it's clear that there was plenty of cross-cultural contact between the Israelites and the Philistines. Samson marries a Philistine woman. He goes in and out of Philistine territory. There's a famous reference in 1 Samuel that the Israelites couldn't forge iron and make weapons, instead having to go to the Philistines for that. They were going to the Philistines for agricultural implements, but the Philistines wouldn't forge weapons for them. Now, this seems to indicate that the Philistines had both martial and technological dominance over the Israelites. David serves as a mercenary for Achish, king of Gath, meaning that some Israelites did have Philistine weapons, but in the story we see that Achish doesn't necessarily trust David, that he will serve him against other Israelites. After the time of David, the Philistines fade from Israelite history, although never completely. The Philistines appear in the 8th century and later prophetic oracles alongside the other traditional enemies of Israel, but that doesn't tell the whole story. It seems that later in the monarchic period, the Philistines fought together with the kingdoms of Israel and Judah against common enemies. Now, by that time, it seems the division of Israel and the waning power of the Philistines left both groups more vulnerable and needing to cooperate rather than to compete. The Bible also provides interesting information about the origins of the Philistines. The prophets recall the Philistines as originating in Caphtor. Amos and Jeremiah both discuss the origins of the Philistines. Amos poses a rhetorical question. Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor? Jeremiah calls the Philistines the remnant of the coast of Caphtor. The Bible clearly preserves a memory that the Philistines were not locals, that they came from somewhere else and migrated to the Levant, just like the Israelites. Now, it's not entirely clear what Caphtor is or where it was. Other ancient sources seem to know of a place called Caphtor or something similar. Modern scholars suggest that Caphtor could be the Cilician coast, or more likely Cyprus or Crete, among others. For more clues about the Philistines' origins, we have to turn to sources beyond the Bible.
The Bible isn't our only source of information about the Philistines. There are in fact several certain extra-biblical references to the Philistines and a few other possible references to them. The most well-known references are the reliefs at Ramses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, a stela at Deir el-Medina, and the Harris Papyrus, which gives more detailed accounts of some of the events shown on the reliefs at Medinet Habu. These sources give some background on how the Philistines came to settle in the southern Levant, though the question of where exactly they came from isn't addressed directly by the Egyptian sources. If you're interested in reading the full accounts, they are all available online. We aren't going to take the time to read through them all, so if you want to find them, you can go look them up. And we'll just reference the parts most relevant to what we're touching on today. Now, it's important to remember that while these inscriptions and reliefs gives us an early account of the Philistines' arrival and settlement in the land of Palestine, it is from a decidedly Egyptian perspective, just as the biblical account is from an Israelite perspective. Neither account is likely what the Philistines would have said about themselves. So when we look at the Egyptian sources, what we see is in the 8th year of Ramses III's reign, Ramses fought off a coalition of peoples in a series of battles. The date of these battles varies depending on the chronology you follow, but archaeologists working in Syria-Palestine usually put it in or around 1175. The confederation he lists as the Peliset, or the Philistines, Jeker, Sheklesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. He says they made a conspiracy in their lands and were confident in their success. These passages led the Egyptologist Gaston Maspero to describe these people as le people de la mer, the peoples of the sea, or as they are now popularly known, the sea peoples. Now, we don't have time to get into the history, archaeology, and migration of the sea peoples right now, but we want to sometime. There's just a lot of data to cover, so stay tuned for that in the future. In the reliefs at Medinet Habu, we see two battles. They're commonly called the Battle of Jahi and the Battle of the Delta. However, most scholars who study this period don't think there are only two battles. Remember, these reliefs, just like the textual sources, have a rhetorical, if not outright propagandistic function. It's entirely likely that there was a series of conflicts between Ramses' forces and these people, but it was presented as two Egyptian victories, one on land and one on sea. In the land battle, Ramses' forces are seen as are those of the coalition. We don't just see the military forces, but also see carts filled with women and children, usually interpreted as the families of the coalition fighters during a presumed migration. This is a fairly motley crew. They're depicted in a variety of styles, and Egyptian artists seem to be showing this as an ethnically or culturally diverse coalition that was migrating into the area. In the sea battle, we see a pretty confusing battle scene with the attackers in their boats after being ambushed by the Egyptians. Egyptian archers are on the shore, keeping them from landing, and then we can see Ramses' boat is shown delivering the killing blow. The aftermath of this battle is discussed in the Harris Papyrus, where Ramses is said to have settled the various groups of the coalition in his own fortresses after he defeated them in battle. The onomasticon of Amenepi seems to associate the Philistines with Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza. In addition to these Egyptian texts, we appear to have several other references to the Philistines, though I'm kind of suspicious of whether they're actually relevant to the biblical Philistines. During the Iron Age, there seems to be a land called Wallestina or Palestine or even Palestine in the Amuk Valley in what is now southern Turkey. There are a few inscriptions which refer to this land of Palestine, which some archaeologists link with the Philistines. And there's some Aegean-style pottery, which is a hallmark of Philistine culture, that was discovered at Tel Tayanat, but most of the names and cultural material at the site is Syro-Hittite, not Philistine or what we would expect from a northern Philistine group. So it's possible some Philistines were in this area, but if they were, it seems they were very quickly assimilated into the local culture. Either way, they have little or nothing to do with the Philistines of the Bible. Another Egyptian text, though, may point to the Philistines originating in Anatolia prior to their migration to the Levant. At the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites fought Ramses the Great and the Egyptians. One of the Hittites' allies is listed as the consonants PDS. Could this be a reference to the Philistines? Well, the Hittites and the Egyptians spoke very different languages from different language families, which are themselves different from Hebrew. Because of these differences, it's possible, even likely, that this PDS, the Egyptians noted as the equivalent of Patasha or Patasa, which is a city close to Arzawa in western Anatolia. The name may be the equivalent of the Hebrew and Akkadian names for the Philistines. So, if this is all accurate, then it may be a historical and linguistic connection with southwestern Anatolia as the homeland of the Philistines. So while we don't have a definitive answer to the question of where the Philistines originated, we do know a lot about the Philistines after they arrive on the Levantine coast. Most of our knowledge of the Philistines comes from archaeology, including more evidence about where the Philistines may have come from. So let's turn our attention to what archaeology can show us about Philistine culture and its relationship with Israelite culture. Archaeologists have noted a number of distinct Philistine cultural elements, and they have uncovered evidence that sheds some light on some of the more confusing elements about the Philistines in the written sources. The Petapolis sites have all been extensively excavated with the exception of Gaza. Multiple other sites have been excavated that have Philistine occupation layers, and these layers allow archaeologists to understand the Philistine expansion from the Petapolis, their contraction back to the Pentapolis core area, and how their culture was distinct, and how it evolved and assimilated with the local Canaanite cultures. There's a lot we could talk about, but we'll focus on the essentials as best we can. Again, first off, we need to understand something important about the nature of Philistine archaeology. Philistine archaeology is haunted by trait lists. That is, archaeologists look for particular traits that are supposedly distinct to the Philistines in order to identify Philistine occupation of a site. These trait lists include cultural artifacts or remnants of cultural practices like Aegean-style pottery, or dietary practices like pork consumption and possibly consumption of the grass pea lentil, hearths, cooking jugs, worshipping the seated goddess, being uncircumcised, using a distinct non-Canaanite language and script. And that's not an exhaustive list. Those are just the ones off the top of my head that I can think of, and I've seen much longer lists. So what's the problem with these trait lists? Looking for distinctive traits may seem like basic archaeological practice, but the issue with these trait lists is that they get conflated with markers of Philistine ethnic identity. Archaeologists who use these trait lists sometimes equate Philistine material culture with Philistine ethnic identity, but it's actually not a good practice to equate these two things. This is a tricky distinction to sort out because trait lists aren't inherently bad. They're important tools for discussing socio-cultural practices, but they aren't lists of ethnic markers, no matter what anyone says. While items on trait lists may be important for identification strategies, not all traits in the list are important for identification. Traits that were ethnic markers for the Philistines almost certainly appear on the trait list you see of the Philistines, but not all Philistine ethnic boundary markers are represented in the trait lists. Again, the cultural aspects on the trait lists of the Philistines do not necessarily equate to ethnic markers, but some of them might have been ethnic markers. So this brings us to a wider discussion in the archaeological literature about Philistine ethnic identity. At the core of this discussion is this question: did the Philistines arrive in the southern Levant as a unified people with a shared identity, or was Philistine identity a relatively novel innovation forged together from a diverse group of people from various cultural and geographical backgrounds? Where the scholarship seems to be trending, and I think quite rightly, is to understand the Philistines arriving in the southern Levant as a fairly diverse people, though from roughly the same area in southwestern Anatolia and the islands around it. Their Philistine identity was forged in response and in opposition to their neighbors in their new lands, people like the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and the Israelites. Ethnic identity invariably involves defining one group against another. An in-group with no out-group will splinter so that there are out-groups. A group's identity is always negotiated in relation to those around it. So the Philistines unified from a diverse group into a more homogeneous group, partially defined against their neighbors in the highlands. We see the same thing happening as the Israelites define themselves against neighboring people groups like the Philistines. So back to the trait list. What you always see first in any Philistine trait list is Aegean-style pottery. Excavations at Philistine sites have revealed a distinctive kind of pottery that is associated with the arrival of the Philistines. Now, to talk about Philistine pottery, we're going to bring in one of our new team members, Kristen Flake.
Early Philistine pottery looks like Mycenaean pottery, the kind of pottery manufactured and traded from late Bronze Age Greece. In fact, early excavations called the first phase of Philistine pottery Late Mycenaean 3C 1B, which may not mean a lot if you didn't know the sequence of late Helladic ceramic wares. But the point is that the first pottery associated with the Philistine looks like Mycenaean pottery. But analysis of the clay showed that this pottery was made from local clay, not clay from Greece. This would point to, at the very least, potters trained in Mycenaean ceramic tradition being a part of the Philistine movement and producing pottery locally. It's probably safe to say that a sizable portion of the early Philistines came from within the Mycenaean cultural world around the Aegean. Following the first phase of Philistine pottery, what was called Mycenaean 3C1B, and now called Philistine monochrome, is another distinctive ceramic style called Philistine bichrome. As you might expect, Philistine bichrome is typically two colors, red and black. It has a variety of decorative motifs including Egyptian and Canaanite motifs, along with a lot of Aegean motifs and Aegean ceramic forms. It's a fusion of Aegean influences with local Canaanite ones. Philistine pottery changes quite dramatically in the 10th century to a style formerly called Ashdod ware, but what we now call late Philistine decorated ware. This style loses a lot of Aegean distinctiveness of earlier Philistine pottery, and it represents the contraction of Philistine power and closer assimilation with neighboring people groups. Philistine monochrome is found only in the core Pentapolis sites and is only a fraction of the total assemblage. Philistine bichrome, in its many subphases, is found in larger quantities in a broader geographical range. Most scholars recognize this pottery or some of its forms and styles as an element in Philistine identification, as it was a marker of their Aegean heritage.
Dietary practices are another distinctive marker of Philistine culture. Philistines cooked on hearths, an architectural feature not used in the Levant in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age outside of Philistia. And they used cooking jugs, both of which speak to new dietary practices. Dietary practices are typically very conservative and are often used as markers of ethnic identification. Imagine moving across the world to a new place, or even just going on vacation. One thing you always miss is home cooking. You want food like your mother used to make. You want to marry someone who will cook the foods you grew up eating. Foodways are often among the last things to change in immigrant groups. It seems to be the same way with the Philistines. One thing they ate was pork. Lots of pork. Zooarchaeologists have examined the faunal assemblage at sites in the Iron One, and Philistine sites consistently have a much higher rate of pork consumption than other contemporary sites, whether they are Israelite or even Canaanite. Another thing which may pertain to Philistine identification is language. It's clear from both archaeology and textual sources that the Philistines initially spoke a non-Semitic language. So what language was dominant amongst the Philistines in the early stages of their settlement is not clear. A common suggestion is the language associated with the as yet undeciphered Cypro-Minoan script, but again, it's not clear. We see several Philistine words in the Bible that are translated or maybe transliterated into Hebrew. The name Goliath, for example, is not a Semitic name. Scholars have suggested it is the Lydian name Alwates, and more recent research points to it being two names spelled A-L-W-T and W-L-T, and both names are seen in Anatolia. The name Achish also appears in the Bible. In Assyrian text, this name is spelled as Ikausu. In this temple dedicatory inscription from Ekron, we see it spelled this way. As with all of these words, its meaning is debated, but a common suggestion is that it means the Achaean or the Greek. In the Bible, we also see the word Sarin used to describe the leaders of the Philistines. This word is also not Semitic and seems to be what the Philistines used to describe their leaders. This was originally linked with the Greek word tyrannos and thought to go back to the Mycenaean Greek world. However, we know the titles used in the Mycenaean Greek world, and this isn't one of them. There are inscriptions in the Levant language, including from Tel Tayanut, that use the term tarwanis to refer to a kind of ruler. Why this title was used and what it meant really isn't clear. It seems to be the source of the Greek term tyrannos, which may give some indication of how the title functioned. It may be something equivalent to a warlord or something like that. However, this role originally functioned. Over time, the Philistines adopted the kind of hereditary kingship we see among the Iron Age secondary states of the southern Levant. The same inscription from Ekron refers to Ikausu's father Padi, the ruler of Ekron. And this indicates the Philistine leadership was hereditary by the 7th century. And notably, this Ekron inscription uses an alphabetic Canaanite script. And this is the trend we see archaeologically at Philistine sites. After the Iron I and quickly in the Iron II, or around the 10th century, Philistine foreign distinctives are dropped, and Philistine culture becomes much more Canaanized. Their pottery loses its Aegean motifs and forms, their script is the local one, their pork consumption decreases. A lot of the earlier Philistine distinctives, including some of their ethnic boundary markers, disappear. And Philistine material culture comes to look more and more like the local Canaanite culture. But Philistine identity did not disappear completely. We know they continued as a distinct entity during the period of the Israelite monarchies, but how they expressed that identity drastically changed in the Iron II. And the question is, why? Why? And the answer is not entirely clear. It may be that they lost their status as a dominant militaristic and expansionistic group. Fitting in with their neighbors may have become more advantageous as their neighbors to the north in Phoenicia and to the east in the highlands grew militarily and economically stronger. Being foreigners may have been too costly. The adoption of the local Canaanite script may have facilitated economic relations. Why they changed the ways they negotiated their identity in the Iron II really isn't clear, and how they maintained their identity or to where their boundary markers shifted is also debated. But the archaeology is clear that Philistine material culture in the Iron I is drastically different from the Iron II.
So, to conclude, let's summarize a kind of brief history of the Philistines. We can start in the Bronze Age in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. In the late Bronze Age, the Philistines, or the people who would become the Philistines, most likely lived in southwestern Turkey, possibly around the region of Arzawa or along the Aegean coast. They were familiar with the Mycenaean cultural world and were adept at reproducing it. During the Bronze Age collapse, the Philistines aligned themselves in a confederacy of other peoples, whom we now call the Sea Peoples. They may have begun as pirates, mercenaries, and raiders, but they ended up as migrants, moving their families from their ancestral and cultural homeland. They engaged in conflict with the Egyptians, but were not victorious, possibly disastrously so. They ended up settling or being settled on the border of Egypt at the sites of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath early in the 12th century. From there, the Philistines became a kind of dominant aristocracy over the native Canaanite population. The Philistines kept their Aegean Anatolian culture and used it to distinguish themselves from their Canaanite and Israelite neighbors. Over the course of the Iron I, they expanded from their core Pentapolis sites. They raided into the highlands, and particularly north and northeast along the Via Maris, the most significant trade route along the coastal plain. Destructions at sites such as Dor, Megiddo Stratum 6a, Yokneam, Shiloh, and Beth Shean may all be related to Philistine expansion deeper into the Levant. This expansion may have also included other Sea People allies of the Philistines. The Philistines didn't occupy these cities, only plundering them, it seems, but as they continued their path of destruction, their neighbors united against them. The disparate tribes and clans of the highlands united around the Israelite king Saul, who halted the Philistine raids into the highlands. David built on the successes of Saul and further secured Israelite territory. During the reign of Solomon, the pharaoh Seamun I campaigned into the Levant and the Philistines were defeated. At Ekron, the lower city, Stratum 4, was destroyed, and in the Iron II, the site was only occupied in the upper city for the next 270 years. Ashdod's Stratum 10 was also destroyed, likely by Seamun. This militaristic and no doubt economic setback may have been what triggered the Philistines to acculturate with their neighbors. In the Iron II, the 10th century and beyond, the Philistines appear to be like any other Levantine polity. Their Aegean and Anatolian distinctives largely fade. Genetic analysis of a Philistine necropolis at Ashkelon showed most of the population was of local Canaanite origin. As the Iron II progressed, the Philistines were less of a unified group in which the traditional Iron I Pentapolis sites worked together. Even in the biblical text, we see the Pentapolis sites divorced from one another in the Iron II period. For example, in 2 Chronicles, Uzziah fought Ashdod and Gath, but we don't hear about the other cities being involved. Instead, the individual cities each have unique histories and trajectories of success and decline from this point forward. Ekron declined in significance from the time after its lower city was destroyed until it fell under Assyrian control, when it became an olive oil manufacturing powerhouse. Gath became an important urban center in the 10th and 9th centuries, but it was destroyed by the Aramean king Hazael. Due to the Philistines' location on the Via Maris, between Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, they had to reckon with all the great imperial powers of the region. We have references to Philistia in Assyrian texts from the time of Adad-nirari III. After putting up some stiff resistance in the 8th century, the Philistines seemed to be good vassals in the 7th century, largely profiting from their economic incorporation into the Assyrian Empire. The Philistines, as with Judah, fell to the Neo-Babylonians and suffered a similar fate as the Judahites. They never recovered from their encounter with the Babylonians. And while the Philistine people disappeared at the end of the Iron Age, they did give the region their name. Philistia turned into Palestine. Some of their cities are still there. Gaza, Ashdod, and Ashkelon are all important urban centers today. The Philistine people may be long gone, but their influence continues to be felt to this day. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you like what you saw, we think that you'll also like our other videos on people groups of the Bible. So be sure to check out the videos that are popping up on the screen right now. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Beneath the Bible. And remember, you can support our work at ko-fi.com/beneaththebible. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep digging.